By the beginning of 1971, the United States was in the throes of Vietnamization, the Nixon administration's push to end U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Its objective was to equip and train South Vietnamese forces for an ever-increasing combat role while simultaneously reducing the number of U.S. combat troops. At that time, 24-year-old Oklahoma native David Stinson was a U.S. Army first lieutenant who had been in country for 7 months. He was assigned to Sea Troop in the 7th Squadron of 17th Air Cavalry as a combat pilot flying the venerable AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter. His unit had recently moved from An Khe in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam to Lane Army Airfield, just outside the city of Quy Nhon. Within just a few weeks, he would find himself at the heart of a massive, highly secret, and exceptionally dangerous operation that would take the fight across the South Vietnam border into neighboring Laos. The journey would take David and the rugged Cobra gunship he was flying through a series of extraordinary events, testing the mettle of both man and machine, pushing both to their limits. In late January 1971, David's unit was suddenly redeployed to the northernmost reaches of Quang Tri Province, just south of the demilitarized zone, more commonly known as the DMZ, separating North and South Vietnam. David and his fellow Air Cav aviators had no idea why they were being sent north, or why they were paired up for orientation flights with elements of the Air Cavalry Squadron that served the 101st Airborne Division. But they knew it was something big. After spending a miserable, cold, and rainy week in Quang Tri, on February 7th, all of the forward elements of David's troop, along with several other aviation units, engineer units, mechanized infantry, and other units, were moved west to the infamous Quai Son, the former Marine Corps combat base located just a few kilometers east of the Laotian border and south of the DMZ. Late that afternoon, they learned for the first time the nature of the mission, Operation Lam Son 719. The ground offensive into Laos would be carried out by the South Vietnamese Army. The United States provided logistical, aerial, and artillery support for the operation, but its ground forces were prohibited by law from entering Laotian territory. The plan centered on the treacherous Route 9, a narrow dirt track that would become the axis of advance. The objective was to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail along a 40-kilometer swath from the South Vietnam border all the way west to the small Laotian town of Chapon and disrupt vital supply lines to the Viet Cong. Operation Lam Son 719 kicked off on the morning of February 8, 1971, when South Vietnamese Army forces crossed into Laos. They were supported by the U.S. Army's airborne armada of more than 750 helicopters, including Sea Troops AH-1 Cobra gunships, UH-1 Hueys, and OH-6 Loach light observation helicopters. In the first week of the operation, the South Vietnamese Army troops, operating without the guidance of U.S. advisors due to political constraints, faced a stubborn resistance and were pinned down. U.S. Army helicopter units and Air Force air-to-ground assets continued to fly mission after mission, from 500 to 800 sorties each day, providing much-needed supplies to the South Vietnamese Army and evacuating their wounded. As well as attacking and suppressing the deeply entrenched North Vietnamese Army positions that were well equipped with heavy weaponry and formidable anti-aircraft defenses. Any aircraft flying at normal tactical altitude over Laos was at grave risk. David and his fellow air crews found themselves in an increasingly perilous environment. Aircraft and crew losses among U.S. aviation units that week were bad and getting worse each day. It was an environment that none of them had ever experienced while flying their normal missions throughout South Vietnam. In the 5 days leading up to his fateful mission, the aircraft David was flying were shot up 4 out of those 5 days. Just the day before, David and his wingman had been ambushed by 2 or 3 of the much-feared Russian-manufactured Dishka 51 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns, while trying to conduct a low-level recon mission for the next phase in the South Vietnamese assault in Laos. Miraculously, neither of them was hit by a .51 caliber round, but both were riddled by AK-47 fire while trying to escape the ambush. Both air crews made it back to Lam Son with, surprisingly, neither of the pilots or co-pilot gunners hit. However, those two gunships were no longer flyable. The next day, on that fateful Saturday morning, February 13th, 1971, a flight of 5 Sea Troop helicopters embarked on yet another daring mission. Their destination? Chapone, a heavily contested area deep in Laos. A single Huey, serving as the command and control aircraft, was flying at several thousand feet to avoid ground fire, and was accompanied by 1 Cobra gunship flying high cover. Down low was 1 LOH as the lead of the low-level reconnaissance team, with 2 Cobra gunships in close trail for fire support. The mission seemed crazy to those flying it. Their objective was to dash 40 kilometers into enemy territory, take a look around, and, as it was explained to them, see what was out there. But they all knew what was out there. All the bad guys in the world, with all the small arms and anti-aircraft weapons anyone could ever imagine. David was flying the low-level trail Cobra, tail number 15327. His co-pilot gunner was Warrant Officer Steve Wilton. His call sign was White 3. As they ventured deeper into Laos, about 5 kilometers from Firebase Salui, the North Vietnamese army sprung a deadly ambush. The sound was unmistakable. The resonant noise and deliberate rate of fire of those dreaded Dishka .51 caliber anti-aircraft guns. It was instantly terrifying, especially when you were right down there with them. And it was hauntingly familiar to David after the close encounter he had had with those hated weapons the day before. Before anyone could react or call out, taking fire, something slammed into the right side of David's Cobra like a brick shot out of a cannon. Instantly, the flight controls went stiff. David felt like he was going to lose control of his bird. Cobra 327 had no hydraulics. The cyclic was bucking and shaking in his hand, and the aircraft was not responding to normal control movements. The pedals felt like they were stuck. They were still traveling at nearly 100 knots, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in as the aircraft wobbled just above them. Amidst the chaos, the lead LOH and the lead Cobra veered away from the ambush site. David fought to stabilize his crippled Cobra. He called out on the radio.
This is 3. We're hit. Our guards are gone.
The lead Cobra circled back to help. David looked around for a spot to immediately land. He spotted an opening between some tall trees with a clean, straight stretch of the primitive dirt track and wrestled his wounded Cobra to the ground. The landing was rough, but David and his co-pilot gunner, Steve, were on the ground and in one piece. As David quickly assessed the current situation, he noticed movement nearby. As he looked closer, he saw several soldiers with weapons coming through the bush along the side of the road. David's heart sank. He and Steve were both still in the aircraft, and it was impossible for them to find cover before the soldiers were right on top of them. They were sitting ducks with only a couple of nearly useless standard pilot-issue .38 caliber revolvers. David reconciled himself to the fact that within the next 30 seconds, they were either going to be killed or captured. Just then, it finally registered that the approaching soldiers were wearing green uniforms, not khaki. And they were carrying M16s, not AK-47s. Against the odds, they had crashed right in front of a South Vietnamese patrol from Firebase Sa Louie. A few minutes later, the LOH flew back across the crash site, soon followed by the command and control Huey, which circled overhead and landed on the road just in front of the downed Cobra. David and Steve stood up, grabbed their gear, and said their goodbyes to the South Vietnamese soldiers that came to their aid. David and Steve climbed into the Huey, which soon took off quickly to the east, leaving behind the maimed Cobra 327. David closed his eyes and thanked God for their narrow escape, the unexpected help from those South Vietnamese soldiers, and the fact that they were safely on their way out of Laos. Overall, Operation Lam Son 719 failed to achieve its objective. Initial successes were short-lived. The enemy supply lines remained unbroken. The viability of Vietnamization was called into question. The battle was a costly one. It would prove to be the costliest operation to U.S. Army aviation of any single operation during the war. 19 U.S. Army aircrew were killed in action, including 4 from Sea Troop. 59 were wounded, including at least 7 from Sea Troop, and 11 were missing in action. 108 helicopters were destroyed and 600 damaged, including David's Cobra 327. Within a few months, First Lieutenant David Stinson was promoted to captain, and he returned stateside. In 1973, he separated from the Army and went on to earn his law degree from the University of Oklahoma College of Law in 1976. That same year, he joined the highly esteemed Oklahoma law firm McAfee and Taft, where he practiced for 43 years. Over the course of his distinguished career, he established himself as one of the region's most trusted go-to energy lawyers and earned recognition with leading national legal publications. He retired in early 2019. Later that year, nearly 50 years after that fateful Saturday morning, out of the blue, David was contacted by Mike Cochran, a fellow Sea Troop pilot. They hadn't been in contact with each other since Vietnam. David was astounded to learn that his Cobra survived that ill-fated mission. Cobra 327 had gone on to have its own distinguished career in the years since. Up until this moment, David still believed his fallen bird had been left in Laos. Evidently, after David and his co-pilot gunner had been airlifted out from the crash site, those same South Vietnamese soldiers who had come to their aid subsequently secured the downed aircraft. Within hours, a Chinook recovery team arrived to sling-load the gunship back to Quang Tri. Sometime later, when the U.S. Army received new helicopters, Cobra 327 was retired to public service. The former gunship helicopter then began its second career as a firefighting helicopter with the Kern County Fire Department in California. It was especially adept in working during nighttime fires with its military infrared scanners that could help locate people through dense smoke. Its exceptional maneuverability and ruggedness allowed rescue pilots to land close to the fires, resulting in noticeable burn marks still visible at the time of its second retirement. In 2019, Martin County's Veterans Memorial Committee in Fairmont, Minnesota, secured the twice-retired Cobra 327 and embarked on a year-long restoration of the aircraft. Cobra 327 was dedicated in a special ceremony on August 1st, 2020. Cobra 327 now stands as the centerpiece of the Martin County Veterans Memorial, which also features an 80-foot black granite wall engraved with the names of veterans and life-size bronze statues of military soldiers representing all past and current war eras. David was reunited with the bird he thought he would never see again. It was truly incredible that Cobra 327 had been recovered and had had another life after Vietnam. He was glad to see that it, too, had made it back home.